The Tales of Hoffmann, Les Contes d'Hoffmann, is an opera that's undergone a very lengthy and complex gestation period. It was adapted from a play by Jules Barbier and Michel Carré, which was produced in 1851 in the Odeon. Now, this in turn was adapted from a series of stories, peculiar stories that in fact gave Freud the opportunity to talk about what he called the uncanny in English, in German the unheimlich, the something that should be hidden. These stories written by E.T.A. Hoffmann in the early 19th century. Now, E.T.A. Hoffmann was a Prussian. His Barbier adapted three main stories: The Sandman, which was written in 1816, Councillor Crespel, which was written in 1818, and The Lost Reflection, which was written in 1814. Now, to these he also added the story of Klein Zach, which must have had particular resonance for Jacques Offenbach. Klein Zach, little Jacob. Jacques Offenbach's name was originally Jacob. He also had a Russian dog called Klein Zach. Now, to these, probably we would add the vampire. Offenbach's adaptation of Tales of Hoffmann is a brilliant synthesis of Hoffmann's work. The original plans for the original production invested so much money in designing the Venice final act that although the final act was not fully written by the time the first production took place, the Munich act was reconceived to take place in Venice, and the barcarolle was transposed from the third act to the second act, and so that's where some of the confusion begins. There's two operettas that Offenbach wrote before he got to Tales of Hoffmann, which are based on E.T.A. Hoffmann's work. There's Le Roi Carotte and Fantasio, and both of them are in 1872. So in the opera we've got a series of recurring characters. We've got the heroines, Olympia, Antonia, Giulietta and Stella, and all of these are intended to be emanations of the same woman. Now, the four parts were intended to be played by Marie Heilbronn, who had just had a magnificent success with Traviata. But within 2 years of all these plans, Offenbach, on the 5th of October in 1880, died, and the opera was incomplete. Then we've got the villains, who are also recurring and should possibly be played by the same actor. Lindorf, Coppelius, Dr. Miracle and Dappertutu. And then we've got these additional characters, Spallanzani, Schlemiel, Crespel. Now, Crespel is interesting because Crespel is one of a series of disfigured characters. The first that we meet is in the prologue. It's Klein Zach, an image of the ugly, and Hoffmann himself considered himself to be ugly, and yet Klein Zach is in love. Then we have Hoffmann himself, who seems to age, and he's accompanied by the Muse, who in the prologue, at least in the version that has been recovered, has transformed herself into Niklaus. Offenbach describes his wife as his muse, and that seems perfectly reasonable, though she does look a little severe. Then we've also got the servants. Pitichinaccio, who's a character from Salvator Rosa, Signor Formica, Franz, and Cochineal, who is the assistant to Spallanzani, who has created the doll Olympia. Now for the stories themselves. How were they put together, and what is the complexity, and how is the opera that we see today maybe different from the opera that Offenbach intended? Now, of course, let's start with the 1950s screen adaptation by Powell and Pressburger, probably one of the most amazing films, probably one of the most amazing fantasy films ever produced, with spectacular imagery. But the story it tells is not what Jacques Offenbach intended. First of all, the order that Powell and Pressburger tell the stories is wrong. From its origins as a play in 1851, it's then transformed into an opera by Salomon in 1867. Now, this opera wasn't at all successful, and it wasn't even a matter of it flopping. It didn't even get performed, and Offenbach was given the libretto in 1873. Now, at that point, it was going to be produced in the Salle Farvat. Also at that point, Offenbach conceived of Hoffmann as a bass, partly because he was able to use the man who just had a supreme success playing the part of Escamillo in Carmen. But a series of bankruptcies at the Salle Farvat, the Gaieté Lyrique, which then became the Theatre Lyrique, with a new manager, Visentini, and then Visentini goes bankrupt and the whole thing goes over to the opera-comique. Now, the opera-comique was controlled by the great tyrant of theatre producers at that time, Leon Cavallo. And he insisted that Hoffmann was transformed from a bass to a tenor. He also insisted on the part of Olympia being rewritten with a higher tessitura for Adele Isaac. After Offenbach's death, the piece then passed to his son, who asked for a man who understood what Offenbach intended, Ernest Guiraud, to complete the orchestration and the setting of the recitatives. Indeed, he'd done the same sort of thing for Bizet's production of Carmen. That version of the opera had its premiere in Vienna. There's then a production at Hamburg in 1882. Now, the first production, although the text was written, it was produced without the Giulietta Act. The Hamburg production got the Giulietta Act, which was also seen in Paris in 1911. In the meantime, an entirely different version of the opera was developed by the Edition Schoudon, which gets its first production in Berlin in 1905, and that becomes the standard production which was used for about 90 years. The big crisis in the development of the opera was the burning down of both theatres that hosted the premiere, and all the original manuscripts were believed at that point to be lost. And then we go on a long period of discovery, starting in 1970, when 1,250 pages of manuscript were discovered. But it's not until the 90s that these manuscripts are convincingly put back together. And there's a series of discoveries. In 1984, there's significant material rediscovered, and in 1993, even more material rediscovered, and with the help of a man called Jean-Christophe Keck, this restoration was able to take place. So today we can put the act back in their original order, back in the order that Offenbach intended, with the prologue and an extended epilogue, the Olympia Act, pretty well as it always has been, the Antonia Act, followed by the Giulietta Act, a process of decay from loving a doll, loving a woman who is destined to some strange musical death, to being bewitched by a courtesan in Venice.